For years I said it. I said it to people sitting across from me in hospital rooms, in waiting rooms, in living rooms where someone had just received news they didn't know how to carry. I said it the way you say things you believe are true. Which is to say, I said it without really thinking. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I believed that. Or I believed it. There's a difference, and I didn't know the difference then. Here's what I actually believed, without knowing it, that suffering was a test. You passed it by surviving, and surviving, by itself, made you different, made you better, made you more than you were before. Like a scar is proof of healing. I was wrong about that. Not completely wrong. Wrong about the mechanism. And here's the thing about being wrong about the mechanism. You can have the right general direction and still be sending people the wrong way. Because when you tell someone who just got destroyed that surviving is enough, you're not helping them. You're handing them a phrase that sounds like a map and hoping they figure out on their own that it's not. Jung gave me the actual map. And I've been sitting with it for weeks now, because the map is not comfortable. The map shows something I wasn't ready to see. About why some people come out of devastation indestructible, and why others come out of the exact same level of destruction still breaking years later. And the difference has nothing to do with how strong they are. I need you to stay with me here. Before I go any further, if this is the kind of conversation you've been looking for, the kind where we actually go deep instead of staying on the surface, subscribe. Hit that button, because I have a lot more of these, and the algorithm needs to know you want them. Okay, back to Jung. I worked in hospice care for 12 years. If you don't know what hospice care is, it's end-of-life care. You work with people who are dying and with the families of people who are dying. You hold a lot of hands. You listen to a lot of things people have never said out loud before, because when you know you're running out of time, things that seemed impossible to say suddenly become necessary. Not important things, true things. There's a difference there too, and in a hospice room you learn the difference fast. 12 years, a lot of hands. And in 12 years, I noticed something that I didn't have language for yet. Some patients, not all, not even most, but some, had a quality about them that I can only describe as settled. Not resigned, not defeated. Settled in a different way, like someone who has been through the very bottom of something and came out knowing, in their body, not just their mind, that there was a floor, that they had touched it, and were still here. It wasn't peace in the way you'd imagine. It wasn't tranquility or acceptance in the religious sense. It was more like steadiness, like a person who no longer had to brace for the worst because they already knew what the worst felt like, and they had survived it. And now, the bracing was gone. And when I talked to these people, when they actually opened up, because some of them would, they almost all had one thing in common. They had been through something. Before the illness, before this room, before me. Something that had genuinely destroyed them. A loss, an abuse, a betrayal, a collapse of who they thought they were. Not a hard year, not a difficult period. Something that had actually dismantled them. Not something that had made them stronger in the generic sense. Something that had actually taken them apart. And they had come out of it as a different person. Not a better version of the same person. A different person. Built differently. I didn't understand that then. I filed it somewhere in the back of my mind and kept doing my job. Then I burned out. I burned out at 40, which is, let me be honest, embarrassing to admit when you've spent years working with people facing actual death. But that's what happened. I stopped being able to separate myself from the grief in those rooms. I took it home. I took it to sleep. I stopped sleeping. I stopped knowing who I was when I wasn't someone else's container for pain. My divorce had finished taking apart whatever the hospice work had started on. I was 40 years old, sitting in an empty apartment in Asheville, not recognizing myself in the mirror and not being entirely sure that was a problem I knew how to solve. My therapist handed me memories, dreams, reflections during what I can only describe as the worst year of my adult life. And I opened it the way you open something you don't really expect to change you. Skeptically. Tiredly. Like, fine, I'll read the dead Swiss man's autobiography, sure. But then I hit a passage that made me put the book down. Jung wrote this: the actual processes of individuation, the conscious coming to terms with one's own inner center, generally begins with a wounding of the personality and the suffering that accompanies it. This initial shock amounts to a sort of call. A call. Not an accident. Not collateral damage. Not a random event you have to survive and then get past. A call. I read that 3 times. And then I thought about those patients. The ones with that settled quality. The ones who had been taken apart and come back different. And something started to make sense in a way that what doesn't kill you never did. But I didn't understand it yet. Not really. Because there's a version of what Jung is saying that still sounds like the cliché, like, suffering is actually good, and you should look for the gift in the pain. And I was allergic to that version. I'd seen enough real destruction to know that there is no gift inside some of it. The loss of a child is not a call to anything. Some pain is just pain, and telling people otherwise is cruel in a specific way. The cruelty of someone who hasn't been through it, handing you something that sounds wise so they can stop feeling uncomfortable about your situation. So I almost stopped there. I almost said, okay, interesting philosophical framing, but it's still just a more sophisticated version of the same thing. Suffering builds character. Whatever. I've heard it. I've said it to people in hospital rooms. I know what it sounds like. And I know it doesn't actually help. But there was a detail I kept coming back to. A word. Conscious. The conscious coming to terms with one's own inner center. Not the suffering. The conscious coming to terms. Jung wasn't saying the wound builds you. He was saying something much more specific and much harder to argue with. He was saying, there is a process, and the wound is not the process. The wound is what begins the process, what initiates it, what creates the conditions for it. But whether the process happens at all depends on something else entirely. I went looking for what that something else was, and I found the research on post-traumatic growth, which, I want to be clear, is not a soft, inspirational concept. This isn't something you find in a wellness blog. Tedeschi and Calhoun, 1996, Journal of Traumatic Stress, documented it as a formal psychological phenomenon, positive psychological change that occurs as a result of the struggle with highly challenging life crises. 5 specific domains. New possibilities relating to others. Personal strength. Spiritual change. Appreciation of life. 5 measurable domains. Not 5 feelings. 5 areas of psychological structure that change. And then I found the numbers that stopped me cold. 65% of trauma survivors experience post-traumatic growth. 25% develop PTSD. Now, I want you to sit with that for a second, because 65% is not a small number. That's not a statistical quirk or a hopeful outlier. That is what happens most of the time when a human being goes through something that should have broken them. Most of the time, not sometimes, not occasionally. Most of the time. But And this is the part I wasn't ready for. 25 to 35% don't. They go through the same level of destruction, the same loss, the same betrayal, the same collapse of who they thought they were. And they don't come out indestructible. They come out more fragile in specific ways, more susceptible to the same pattern repeating, more vulnerable to the same kind of person, more likely to end up back in the same kind of room with a different face across from them. The empath researchers have documented this in the narcissistic abuse recovery community specifically. Survivors who appear to have healed, who stopped the relationship, moved on, started over, but then found themselves in the same dynamic with a different person. Not because they were weak, not because they didn't try, because something in the process didn't complete, because the destruction happened but the conscious work didn't follow. I almost said it wasn't fair, but that's not the right response. The right question is, what's the difference? Not intelligence, not resilience in the conventional sense, not willpower or character or whatever we usually mean when we say strong. Jung had the answer, and it's not comfortable. The difference is what you do with it. Here's what Jung found, and this is the part that changed how I understand everything I saw in those 12 years of hospice work. The people who come out indestructible are not the ones who survived the most. They're not even the ones who felt it the least. They're the ones who went toward it instead of around it, who didn't look away from what the destruction opened up. Who had the courage, and I don't use that word lightly, to look at what was exposed when the structure came down? Jung called this shadow integration. And shadow integration is, let me be careful here, because this is where most explanations get vague and mystical, and I don't want that. Shadow integration is not a metaphor. It's not a spiritual practice. It's a psychological process with a very specific description. The shadow is the part of you that you couldn't be allowed to be, not the dark, dramatic version that people tend to imagine. Not some hidden monster. The quiet version. The part of you that learned, very early, that certain feelings were not safe to have. Certain responses were not acceptable. Certain truths about what you needed, what you felt, what you were capable of. Those got suppressed. Pushed down. Hidden. Not because you were weak. Because you were intelligent enough to adapt. Because when you're small and the environment requires a certain version of you, you produce that version. And you produce it so well that eventually you forget you're producing it. The adaptation becomes the identity. And what doesn't fit the adaptation goes underground. But here's what happens when you suppress something long enough. It doesn't disappear. It builds pressure and the kind of destruction that comes with a genuinely devastating experience. Abuse, abandonment, identity erasure, the systematic dismantling of who you thought you were. That destruction doesn't just take things, it opens things. It breaks down the structures that were keeping the suppressed material contained. For most people, this feels like falling apart. And it is falling apart. There's nothing metaphorical about it. Your sense of who you are comes undone. Your certainties unravel. The version of yourself you'd been presenting, sometimes for decades, stops being sustainable. And for a while, there's nothing to replace it with. That period is terrifying. I've sat with people in it. I've been in it myself. But what Jung observed, what he documented across decades of clinical work with people who came to him at the absolute bottom of themselves, is that the fall creates access. Access to material that was never reachable before. Material that couldn't be reached because the structures that came down were also the structures keeping you from seeing it. Every psychic advance of man arises from the suffering of the soul, not from surviving the suffering, from the suffering itself, when the suffering is met, consciously, with the willingness to go toward what it opened up. This is why the 65% are different from the 35%. Not because of what happened to them, because of what they did with the opening. And here's what took me a long time to name. The people who came out indestructible built something that wasn't there before. Not recovered something. Not returned to something. Built. New psychological architecture. New capacity for solitude they never had. Not isolation born of fear, but genuine comfort in their own company that couldn't have been there before. Because before, being alone was dangerous. New intolerance for falsity that reads as strange to everyone who knew them before. The sudden inability to sit in a room with someone performing a version of themselves because they've seen what it costs. New ability to detect something wrong in a dynamic before it becomes visible. A sensitivity that feels like a superpower, but is actually scar tissue that became radar. These aren't symptoms of damage. Wait, I need to say that again, differently. Because I think this is the thing that matters most. These changes, the ones empath survivors interpret as something being wrong with them, are evidence of construction. Psychological construction that could not have happened any other way. Because the materials only become available after the destruction. You can't build with materials you can't access, and you can't access them until something breaks through to where they are. I think about a woman I worked with in hospice. Not a patient. A family member. Sitting in the hallway outside her mother's room on a Thursday afternoon, not crying, just present. In a way I hadn't seen before in someone her age. She was maybe 38, 39, and she had this quality about her. That settled quality. I recognized it. The one I'd seen in patients who had been through something. I asked her once, during a break, how she was holding up so steadily, and she looked at me for a moment like she was deciding whether to answer honestly. And then she said, "I fell apart completely a few years ago. I mean, completely. And now I know where the floor is. That's it. That's the whole thing." She knew where the floor was. And knowing where the floor is. Really knowing. Not believing. Not hoping. But having touched it with your hands. And come back up. That is not something you can learn any other way. You cannot be told where the floor is. You cannot read about it and know it. You have to touch it. And the people who have touched it and survived the touching, they carry something the rest of the world doesn't have. Not strength in the gym sense, not toughness in the armored sense. Something quieter, something more permanent. The knowledge that they can survive the worst thing, because they already did. But I want to tell you what this cost me to understand. Because understanding it changed something I can't unchange. And that's the honest part of this conversation. Before I read Jung, before that year with the book, before putting it together with 12 years of watching people die and a burnout that took me apart at the seams, I had a way of looking at trauma. A clean way. The clean way is, it happened. It was terrible. You heal. You move on. There's a before and an after. And the after is supposed to look like the before, but better. That was the model. That was what I offered people, even if I didn't say those words out loud. That's not what I see anymore. Now, when I talk to someone who's been through something that should have broken them, when they describe the new intolerance for superficiality, the unexpected need for solitude, the sudden inability to be in the same kind of relationship they used to accept, I see the mechanism. I see the construction. I see the new architecture they built, sometimes without even knowing they built it, on top of the rubble of the old self. And I can't see them as just healing. I see them as having become something that couldn't have been assembled any other way, which is a harder thing to see, because it means the destruction had a role in the construction. Not a good role. Not a role anyone should have had to play, but a real one. And the weight of that is harder than I expected. because it means I can never tell someone going through destruction that it's going to be okay in the simple sense anymore. That things will go back to normal. Because they won't. And more than that, the best possible outcome isn't a return. The best possible outcome is something that requires the destruction to happen first. That's a difficult thing to hold. I grappled with that for a while. Whether it was ethical to tell someone that, I still grapple with it. Jung wrote, "It is our own hurt that gives the measure of our power to heal." The first time I read that, I thought it was a comfort, like, the hurt you carry is matched by the power inside you. I found that reassuring. I read it like a promise. Now I read it as something sharper. Our hurt is the measure, not the proof, not the badge. The measure, the precise instrument by which we know what we're capable of. And that measure is calibrated by destruction, not by comfort. You don't find out where your ceiling is by staying inside a room where nothing can fall on you. You find out in the rubble. I wish I could tell you that's not true. But I've spent too many years sitting with people at the end of their lives, listening to what they regret and what they don't, to pretend that the comfortable version is the honest one. The comfortable version is kind. The honest version is that some of us got built out of breaking, and the people who went toward the break, who stood in the rubble when every instinct said to run from it, who looked at what the destruction exposed when looking away would have been so much easier, are carrying something now that cannot be taken away. Not because they're special, because of the specific sequence of what happened to them and what they chose to do with the access the destruction created. I want to stop for just a second. I've spent a long time building something with this channel, conversations that don't stay on the surface, that actually try to go where the real thing is. If what I just said landed for you, if it helped you understand something about your own story that felt like it needed a framework, consider leaving a super thanks. It's a way to tell me this matters, and it keeps me doing exactly this. Okay, almost there. I started this with a confession. I told you I used to say what doesn't kill you makes you stronger without really thinking about what it meant, without knowing what the mechanism was, without being able to explain to the person sitting across from me in the hospital room why that was actually true, or what they needed to do to make it true, or why, for some people who survived the same level of destruction, it wasn't true at all. Here's what I know now. The phrase isn't wrong. It's just radically incomplete. And incomplete is sometimes more dangerous than wrong, because it sounds like it explains something when it doesn't. What doesn't kill you can make you stronger, under a specific condition. Not the condition of simply surviving. The condition of meeting, consciously, actively, with sustained effort, what the destruction opened up in you. Jung was clear about this, and I want to quote him, "Exactly because the exact wording matters. The task challenges the whole ego personality, requiring sustained ethical effort rather than a dramatic confession or catharsis. Not a moment, not a breakthrough, not one good therapy session or one honest conversation or one night of crying until something releases. Sustained effort. Going toward the material the destruction exposed, over and over, even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable. The shadow doesn't integrate because you acknowledged it once. It integrates because you keep showing up to the parts of yourself that the destruction made visible. And here's what that builds. Because I've seen it in hospice rooms, in therapy offices, in people who found Jung at the bottom of something and came out the other side carrying something they couldn't have named before they went down. It builds indestructibility. Not in the sense that nothing can hurt you, in the sense that you know you can be destroyed and survive the destruction. And once you know that, really know it, in your body, not just your mind, not as a belief but as a memory, you are no longer afraid of it in the same way. The thing you feared most already happened. and you're still here. And now you know where the floor is. The people I watched in those 12 years who had that settled quality. I understand now what I couldn't name then. They weren't at peace because nothing bad had happened. They were at peace because the worst had happened, and they had gone toward it instead of away from it, and come out the other side knowing something that cannot be taught, only earned. That's not the same as being unbreakable in the fragile sense. It's being indestructible in the real sense, which means you can be broken again. You will feel pain again. Relationships will wound you again. Losses will arrive that you didn't ask for, but you know you'll survive the breaking. And what you'll build in the aftermath will be real in a way that comfort never could have built. Now, there's a detail I need to bring back, because I said early on that being wrong about the mechanism matters, and here's why it matters specifically for you. The research on post-traumatic growth found something the headline number doesn't tell you. The range goes from 10% to 77%, depending on the type of trauma and the population studied. 65% is the average, not the guarantee, not the automatic outcome of surviving, which means the destruction alone isn't the variable. What you do with it is. And here is what I want you to sit with, because this might be the most important thing I'll say. The fact that you are here, watching this video, looking for a framework, trying to understand what happened to you and what it built, puts you inside the process. Right now. Not eventually. Now. You are already doing the conscious work that Jung described. The act of seeking understanding is itself part of individuation. You are not the 35% who survived and stayed broken. You are the person who went toward what it opened. The person who, instead of running from the questions the destruction raised, sat down and said, "Okay, what is this? What did this do to me? What is being built here that I can't yet see?" That is not a small thing. I entered hospice care thinking I was there to help people with death. I left it after 12 years and a burnout that took me apart, understanding that what I had actually been watching was people learning how to live, some of them for the first time, because sometimes it takes the end of something for you to understand what you were made of all along, not what you thought you were made of, what you actually were. Jung didn't give me comfort. He gave me something more durable, a map of the mechanism. Why the destruction isn't the point. Why what you build in the rubble is the point. Why the empath who has been taken apart, systematically, deliberately, by someone who found the exact pressure points and kept pressing, is carrying, inside the very architecture of that destruction, the materials for something that couldn't have existed before. Not because the destruction was good. I want to be clear about that until the last sentence, because I've seen what destruction actually looks like up close, and I have no patience for the version of this conversation that romanticizes it. It was not good. The relationship was not good. What was done to you was not okay. The person who did it does not get credit for what you built from the wreckage. The wreckage was theirs. What you built is yours. But what you built with it, what the process of going toward it created, that is real. That is permanent. And that cannot be taken away. Jung wrote that every psychic advance arises from the suffering of the soul, not from the resolution of the suffering, from the suffering itself. When the suffering is met, when the access it creates is used, when the person who was destroyed decides, consciously, to go toward what the destruction opened up. That's the whole thing. That's why you're different now. That's why the people who knew you before can't quite place what changed. That's why you sometimes don't recognize yourself in old photographs, or old texts, or conversations with people who only knew the version of you that existed before it happened. You're not damaged. You're constructed differently than you were before. And the material that constructed you is indestructible, because it came from the only place that material ever comes from. Tell me something. When you came out the other side of whatever destroyed you, did you recognize what you had built? Or did it take you a while to see it for what it was? Did someone have to point it out? Or did it arrive quietly one day when you weren't looking for it? Leave it in the comments, because I think a lot of people watching this are still inside the construction and don't know it yet. Still in the rubble, still not seeing what's being assembled. And your answer might be the thing someone needs to read today. Take care of yourself.